Welcome again to What a Coincidence podcast. My name is Pastor Don Wolin. I'm the assistant pastor at the Downriver Christian Community Church located on the border of Detroit, Michigan. This podcast is intended to encourage you in your walk with the Lord. We have entitled this What a Coincidence because here at the Downriver Christian Community Church, we have a saying that any time that we see God's hand work in someone's life, what a coincidence. It's a tongue-in-cheek way that we communicate with each other, that God is the one behind the scenes orchestrating everything. This podcast, as I had mentioned, our initial podcast, we're not here to take your money. We're not asking you to send or donate anything. However, if you like to send money, we'd always love that, but we're not here for that. We're not here to get our name out. All churches love to advertise, and we're no exception, but that's not the purpose of this broadcast. And we're not here to say that we're relevant in some form or fashion, that we have a podcast going. We're here just for the glory of God. And as I would like to reiterate, back in 2019, we had a vision at the church, and the vision was, if you believe, you'll see the glory of God. And we talked all the time. People were always looking for the hand of God moving in their life. In 2020 here, we've continued with that, but now we want to proclaim the glory of God. And that was the impetus behind this broadcast itself. So on the first broadcast, we heard the background story of Bernie and Raina Connors and how God moved in their lives, brought them together, brought them to a saving knowledge of himself, but that was just the beginning of the journey. Today we're going to continue on with that journey of how, from the point of they got married to where they end up they came to Detroit and then ended back in the St. Paul, Minnesota area. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bernie and Raina, and if you guys will continue with your testimony as to what God did once you got married.
Okay. So now this is where things get crazy, right? So I'm going to start it out so that my wife gets, because she'll fill in all the, what's that? You're the
detail lady?
All right. So we get married, and we're living up in the UP, which is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where there's more deer than people. We're up there, involved in the ministry. How do we end up going back to St. Paul from that? No, we didn't. Okay. All right. So we're up there doing our thing, and we decide to go on, there's another pastor's conference down in Indiana. And during this time, I had this vision of a window with 8 panes in it, but the window's all blown out, and there's sheer curtains, and they're flowing, and through it is a city that's just dark, and it was like had been under siege, and was a war-torn city. So, move forward. So this happens. It's stuck in my mind. I have no idea what it even is. And we venture out onto this pastor's conference. So the day before we're supposed to leave, my daughter calls me, my oldest daughter. She says, "Dad, I've been praying for you guys, and Lord's telling me for you to go to Detroit." I said, "Oh, cool," because we're going to go down. We're in the Upper Peninsula, so we have to go across that ridiculous bridge.
The Mackinac Bridge?
Yeah, and drive straight through Michigan to get to Indiana. And I said, "Yeah, we can drive through Detroit and go through there and see what happens." So we venture out, we drive through Detroit, and we're passing that the big tire right there on 94. And were you in the back of the van?
No, I was in the passenger seat.
Okay. And we're driving along, and again, this is now the second time that I hear this voice. And because Raina's sitting next to me, and it came from that side of the van, and the voice just said, "This is the city I showed you." And the vision of that window comes back to mind. I'm like, what did you say? And you weren't even paying attention. I don't know what you were doing.
I don't know what I was doing.
And I hear that, and actually I didn't say anything to anybody. Go ahead.
Did either one of you ever know what you were doing?
No, we still don't. No, don't have a clue.
Nope.
So we go to the conference, praying about this. Time goes on, and I finally figure out, all right, we're supposed to go to Detroit.
So we're up in the UP, and I was always told I wasn't able to have children.
I knew if I talked long enough, you'd jump in. There you go.
I was always told I wasn't able to have children, and so I had a surgery and endometriosis, and it was serious, and they said even with IVF, I probably wouldn't be able to conceive. And that was before we were married, before I even thought Bernie was anything in my life. So here we are, and I'm just praying. I'm praying for a child, and, the funny things that you pray for, just be careful. Because I remember praying, I want a child in my image and in my likeness, Lord, because you have a son, Jesus, in your image and in your likeness. It's just something I remember, and now that my son is 7 years old, just be careful for what you pray for. I'm just saying. But the Lord gave us a miracle child. We naturally conceived him out of prayer. And so I'm 7 months pregnant, and we go to Detroit, and we had a lot of backlash. You're going to die. You're going to get shot. You're pregnant. You can't do that. That's not okay. And we kind of got derailed in Toledo for a little while, and our friends in Toledo, meant well, loving. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jesus got sent out in the desert for 40 days, and Paul went into Arabia. Those were seasons in their life to get tough. That's why God sent you to Detroit, to toughen you guys up a little bit. Living high in the hog up there in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
So our friends in Toledo meant well, and they wanted us to stay in Toledo. Well, they wanted me to stay in Toledo, and they wanted Bernie to go start the church in Detroit. But I said, no, we're one, and I am 7 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant. We're going to do this. And we found an apartment on the east side of Detroit, over off on Gratiot and Warren. And there we moved. And we spent a few months there, and we started our church there. We found actually a building on Gratiot and Withhorn, 12301 Gratiot Street. And it was a 3-story building with a billboard on top of it. And it had a major hole in the floor, like a huge 30-foot hole in the floor. And every floor of it was covered in pigeon doo-doo, but that's where we ended up having church. And we had a vacant lot on the side, and we just took it. We mowed it down, put a tent up. Bernie began teaching out of the book of John. The first service we had, 11 people gave their life to the Lord. The second service we had, 3 people gave their life to the Lord, and we just ministered there. We lived there. We ministered there. That was home.
And that area that you were in, could you describe it a little bit? Because you'd never been to Detroit. Was it a good part of Detroit?
No. It was war-torn. I mean, it was vacant houses everywhere. If you haven't ever experienced Detroit and you're listening to this, come drive through Detroit. It is unbelievable.
I think Detroit looks better now than it did then.
You're exactly right that Detroit has undergone an incredible renaissance, in the last 10, 12 years. And so this area that you guys were in, me being from the Detroit area, this was not one of the better parts of the city. And, for you guys to settle there and to open a church was definitely a big step of faith. And I'm sure many a night you guys looked at each other and wondered, why God brought you to this particular destination.
Every hour of every day.
Every hour.
I mean, it was, I mean, we were the vast minority on the east side of Detroit. So many, God did so many things. 2-story, like the one Raina was talking about the first night, people getting saved. We had just set up a tent in the vacant lot next to it, and we had broadcast in a church in Toledo had helped us out, set up the tent. We had broadcast in I don't know, an annual
association, something other.
And so we used that as our launching pad. And so at the end of it, Raina and I went up and we talked about who we were and what we were trying to do in Detroit and what God was telling us. And we just kind of shared a little bit of our testimony. And there was a gentleman there. He had driven up during this thing across parked right next to the tent in this empty lot. And I'm thinking, man, that's weird. Why is that guy parking there? And he gets out, and he's just listening. And I noticed there were people in the car there as well. And so we're sharing our testimony, and the guy comes back afterwards, and he said, while you guys were talking, I stopped. I saw the tent. I opened the window. My son was in the back seat, and he was listening, and he gave his life to the Lord that night.
What a coincidence, huh?
Right. I mean, yeah, that he's driving down Gratiot, sees it, pulls in, has no idea who we even are. I mean, it's our first day in the east side of Detroit setting up, and he pulls in there.
And you guys were probably one of the only white families in that entire area. Is that correct?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Miles.
Yeah. I mean, the story. We've learned so hard to trust God. I mean, Raina, we would walk around the block, and we'd put Trey in the stroller, and we'd just walk around our block, which was incredible. So we're doing this daily when it's nice out. Winter hits, and go ahead. What are you going to say?
I was going to say, after the apartment, we moved to Garland Street by Mack and Bewick area.
Yeah, I mean that, and yeah.
And we found a house on Craigslist, and it was only $1,500, and it wasn't even the guy's house. He just got the money.
Yeah,
but
he
anyway,
just took the $1,500. But we lived there.
Yeah, we lived there for almost a year. But I planted flowers right outside the house. The house was very dilapidated, falling apart. The kitchen leaked, the roof leaked, and Bernie had funneled
the water into buckets.
Sheeted plastic. Yep. So every time it rained, we would funnel the rainwater in big old tubs, and I think there were like 6 of them in the kitchen. Squirrel would come in the kitchen,
eat our bread,
and I would freak out.
Raina would send me videos through a hole in the door showing me the squirrel running around the kitchen.
Say, Lord Jesus, help. Yeah, no, it was serious. No, but I planted flowers. That was one of the very first things I did when we got that house. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of the kids in the neighborhood coming up to me, and she said, "What are you doing?" And then a black lady came. She was like, "My granddaughter trying to be nosy. I'm sorry." And she said, "Hey, neighbor, who are you?" And it was this bubbly lady named Diana. And she was our neighbor, and I got to know her. She would come over every morning for coffee for her and her husband, Harry. We ended up going through the book of James together. Mm-hmm. We ended up going through some Proverbs together. We would pray all the time. She came back to Jesus, and she said, "I honestly believe that God sent you here for me." And we were such a staple, and we made such an impact in the lives of so many people there in that neighborhood. That neighborhood was like family, mm-hmm. and we were accepted as that. I mean, the kids across the street that got into trouble all the time, the scrapper and his sister, and their house ended up getting firebombed, and I got video of that if you want to see it. And just everything. I mean, our other neighbor on the other side that ran everything, that nothing went down in that hood without him knowing it. Our neighbor next door who worked at Chrysler, who was an elderly guy who lived by himself. The other one who was an elderly lady. I mean, I mean, even...
And it wasn't like we were walking up and down the streets preaching. I mean, it was just getting involved in people's lives and just living out the love of God. I mean, that's all it is.
Yeah, so many people feel that they've got to go door to door handing out tracts. And like you said, Raina, earlier in your life, you were, so gung-ho for the Lord. A lot of zeal, but not a whole lot of knowledge. And a lot of times bringing someone to the Lord involves just being part of their lives, developing that relationship with them, having coffee with them in the morning, going down and visiting with them, taking some flowers down to them. And so many Christians don't see that as an opportunity to evangelize, and it really is. Everything in our life should be around that we have to reach out to people first, get to know them before they're going to accept us, as believers, and then they're going to see something different in our life. So that's incredible. Like you said, you're not on the corner. You're not, standing on a milk carton or milk box somewhere yelling and screaming at the traffic going by. You're just part of the neighborhood, and it developed organically. It just developed as the Spirit of God moved upon you guys and moved upon that little community that you guys were in.
It was beautiful, and even the neighborhood alcoholic used to come by and collect our cans, and our other neighbors would say, "You crazy for letting him in there. He's just scoping out to your house because he's just looking to see what he wants to take." But we invited everybody into our house. We didn't have nothing anyways, and our house got, people stole stuff from our house anyway.
When we left town. Yeah.
But that's okay. It's all the Lord's, and everything is the Lord's. And we did this all while having a little baby that was, a little less than a year and little less than a year old, and people loved us. I mean, just a little side story here. It had been 6 years since I went back to that neighborhood, and I just got out of the car just last spring, and went to go see the house before they tore it down, and they did tear it down now, and it was like home again, and the people there were so excited to see me. Just 6 years later, we picked up where we left off some of those people.
Right.
And Diana had a heart attack. She ended up passing away. But her daughter, even 6 years later, still calls us. We ministered to a family right across the street from the church, too. A young man and his girlfriends and their children. And it's just so beautiful to see how my husband, came alongside of this young man and really helped him to be a father and showed him what that looked like, and brought him to a couple pastors' conferences in Philadelphia.
It's just, as a word of encouragement, it's just spending time with people, and once they see you're real, it changes everything. It's not. I used to tell people, look, you can't steal anything from me that I'm willing to give away anyway. So it doesn't. You're not stealing it. Okay. So we move from there over to Christie Street, drug houses on every side. We find out that we're going to have another child, another boy, and he has Down syndrome. And so there's 100 stories in that on how we got to him being born, but he's born and spends the first 6 months of his life in the NICU. Yeah. Intensive care for kids.
And he has an open heart surgery just 2 days shy of being 3 months old. And he actually almost died when he was literally a month old, October 5th. This is another God story I would like to share. So Bernie had gone to St. Paul, Minnesota to go get our oldest Trey from his sister's house. And so I was here in Detroit, and Aaron Matthew, our youngest, was in the hospital. And his blood pressure dropped. His respirations were in the 200s. And his breathing, he would breathe in the single digits. So he would have short respirations. And the doctors told me that he's going to give out breathing and that they had to intubate him. And while I stepped out in the hallway, I actually opened up my Bible and I read in Psalms, and just at that moment, what I had put in my margin of my Bible next to Psalm 8 verse 3 was, Aaron Matthew will survive. God has ordained this for his glory. And I had wrote that when I was pregnant, not knowing at that particular time that I would read that while my son was being intubated, while I was told he's going to give out and to prepare for his death. And so I went back into that hospital room and I said, Aaron Matthew's going to survive. He's going to survive this. And they're like, no, Mrs. Connors, you don't understand the gravity of the situation here. He's probably going to die. And they did transfer him down to Children's. He did make it. Thank you, Jesus. And but there's a lot of stories like that. We've got to minister to so many people through him being in the hospital.
Yeah, and as I'm coming back from St. Paul, Minnesota, back to Detroit, and not knowing what our son was going to have to go through and what my wife was going to have to go through, my whole ride back, I had even were talking to people on the phone and had conveyed what she had just told you about Sam and that Aaron Matthew was going to survive. As I'm telling people, they're getting us ready for him to die. They don't even know the situation, and they're telling us, no, he's not going to survive. But my whole prayer back to Detroit at this point was, don't get me wrong, I didn't want to lose my son, but my prayer was for my wife. I knew if he were to die at that point, our relationship would be completely different, that she wouldn't be able to handle that. And so my prayer was for her the whole way back. God, please don't let my son die, because I love my wife and I don't want to go through that with her. But he was faithful and he survived. So we, I don't know.
Through the hospitalization, we couldn't keep the church going.
We tried. We had Bible study. We moved it to the home. We had Bible studies in the dining room. We could write a book just on that 3-year period. It was unbelievable.
And then after
seeing what God had done.
After the 6 months of hospitalizations, there were 11 hospitalizations after that, up until he was a year old. That kid would continue to get sick and go into respiratory distress. So we had to really be careful who we allowed to come into our house, too, with germs, because he has a very weakened immune system.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Okay, so then I'm dealing with this. I got involved in a men's ministry, people who lived on the street. They bring them into this home and try to get them sober and give them Jesus. And so I'm dealing with this guy. From there, he gets kicked out of the house. He wants to move into another one. They don't have a bed ready for him for a day. And I just told him, I said, well, grab your pillow, your blanket. You're sleeping in the woods tonight, because I ain't bringing him into my house. And so as I drop him off to go sleep on a tree in the middle of the woods, I get a call from St. Paul. Our pastor up there asked me to come back and be his assisting pastor. Now, through this whole time, I'm seeing what my wife's going through, the stress level in the home and everything else. And I said, yeah, we'll come back. And we sell the house and we go back to St. Paul, shut down the church, and go back there to be involved in the ministry back there. And then time goes on. We're up there. We're involved in the ministry. We're still trying to figure out how is Aaron Matthew, how do we do anything with all this going on? He
was on a feeding tube as well, and he needed specialized care. We couldn't just leave him with anybody, and he was sick all and then Trey had...
Because he had that tube up his nose. He had to keep putting that in.
The nasogastric, and then he ended up getting the gastric tube surgically placed. Yep, so he was on a feeding tube. Trey got strep 11 times. I was tired. When we got back to St. Paul, I was glad to see my family. I was relieved to see them, but I was tired. I just wanted to step down and step out of ministry for a minute just to kind of regroup and rest. But I felt like I just needed to keep going.
Right. So then in the late summer of that year, I wrote down 4 things.
3 things.
3 things. And I didn't tell Raina what it was. I mailed it to myself, so I had a postmark on the envelope. And when what I believe God had told me, and I just waited till, I don't know what I was waiting for Raina to just tell me this, and this, and then I knew we were supposed to go back to Detroit. So then in January of the following year,
Yep, it was about January of the following year.
We were sitting around one night talking.
We were at the kitchen table and we were talking. Yep.
And Raina said those 3 things to me verbatim. And I said, all right, hang on. And I went and got the letter, opened it up in front of her, and let her read it. And then the 4th thing was, we need to go back to Detroit.
And I said, no way. Because I was told so let me back up just a titch here. I know that we're running short on time, but...
we're way over time.
Was told we're never going back to Detroit. Get Detroit out of my mind.
Right. Burn the ships.
Burn the ships. And I always desired to go back. And I mourn for Detroit like a death when we left. I did not want to go back to St. Paul at first. And I was kicking and screaming there for about, 2 years. Mm-hmm. And I finally gave it up.
Don't move your finger on it. I can hear it. I'll cut that out. Go ahead.
And I finally gave it up. And that's when Bernie came out with this letter. And I said, no, wait, are you serious? No, you've got to be kidding me. Really? And then I said, we got to pray about this. And I think we prayed about it for 8 months.
Well, I've learned when you say go left, I go right.
and I think we prayed about it 8 months before we told a single soul.
Yep. And then we just told our pastor, we're going. He said, I don't see any red flags.
And then we told our family when we were all over at the youngest daughter's. There was a family get-together there, and you announced it, and the oldest daughter said, I always thought you guys would go back. Mm-hmm.
And so we pulled a Beverly Hillbillies, loaded up the truck, and we moved to Detroit.
Not even knowing where we were going.
No, and through this whole thing, a guy I had known from before when we were in Detroit, he's just recently passed away. I don't know if he called me during that time or...
Somehow you guys got in contact with each other.
And he said, hey, I got an empty house in Melvindale, Michigan, just right on the Detroit border. Why don't you guys live there when you come back? And I'm like, okay. We moved in there and started coming to the church we are at now.
We'll talk about that next time.
Yep.
An incredible journey as you guys were speaking about your trip. I was thinking of the old Johnny Cash song, I've been everywhere, man. And you guys have Minnesota, El Paso, the Upper Peninsula, Detroit, back to Minneapolis, back to Detroit. This incredible journey. And as you were speaking, there's a lot of times in our spiritual walk that, once again, we don't understand the final destination, or if it's just a stone in the creek, so to speak, to step on to get somewhere else. But during this entire time, I was just impressed listening to your story that God was always faithful, that he was always opening doors, that you may have found yourself in what you thought was dire straits, but yet God was with you guys. And, I was reminded in 1 Corinthians 15:58 says, your work in the Lord is not in vain. And sometimes we don't see the fruit being produced. We're tilling the ground. We're planting the seed. We're watering. We're spreading the manure around. Maybe we cash in on somebody else's work. But as you guys even gave testimony, this guy pulling up in the van, his son giving his life to the Lord, you just never know what God is going to do. Well, I want to thank Bernie and Raina today for the continued testimony. And as we get together, we're going to pick up from their move back from St. Paul, Minneapolis area in Minnesota to the Detroit area, and what God has been doing in their life since then. But I think you're getting the gist of everything that's going on, that God was continuing to guide their footsteps, and all along the way, opening doors and shutting other doors. And as they walk through those doors, a whole new experience with Christ emerged, something they never could have planned. And if they tried to plan it, it would all fallen apart. But I think that as we get to their move back to Detroit, you're going to see how all these stories came to fruition and where they're at this day and what God is doing in their life. And so we encourage you to continue, no matter what you're doing, no matter what God has called you to do. Be faithful in there and look for the hand of God. Look for the glory of God to be revealed And you'll see all these coincidences in your life directing you to a deeper relation, a deeper walk with Christ Jesus, your Lord. So once again, we conclude here. We thank God for what he's done and what he's going to continue to do. And as Psalm 3 says, Lord, let your blessing be upon your people. This is Pastor Don Wolin from the Downriver Christian Community Church, wishing you a blessed day, and we will see you the next broadcast. God bless.